24 years of self-imposed isolation and failure for the United States. 58 years of heroic resistance by the Cuban people are behind today's victory. I'm thinking of my people, also of Fidel and Raúl, and particularly of the younger generations of Cubans who were born under the blockade policy and have continued this long, glorious struggle for justice. No one should underestimate the powerful political and ethical message that this UN vote sends to the peoples of the world. The truth ultimately prevails.
In his speech at the UN, the Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez pointed out that while Washington's abstention vote on the resolution was a positive step in the ongoing process towards the normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations, the blockade remains in full effect and should be definitively lifted.
El bloqueo es injusto, inhumano, inmoral e ilegal.
The blockade is unfair, inhumane, immoral, and illegal, and it must be unilaterally and unconditionally brought to an end.
The top Cuban diplomat noted that President Barack Obama has wide executive powers to do a lot more in terms of modifying the application of the blockade, and added that the arbitrary U.S. policy still is the main obstacle to Cuba's development, and its lifting remains a key factor to advance towards fully normalized U.S.-Cuba relations. Washington imposed its policy of blockade against Cuba in October of 1960. It strengthened it in 1992 with the Torricelli Law, which prohibited foreign-based subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba, travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens, and family remittances to the Caribbean states. Later, again in 1996, Washington further tightened its blockade by passing the Tax-Working Act. In its Title III, the superpower claimed for itself the right to penalize nationals and companies from third countries doing business with Cuba involving property nationalized by Cuba after the revolution that could have some U.S. connection. No sector of Cuban society escapes the impact of the U.S. blockade. It negatively affects family economy, wages, services, product prices, and consumption levels. Tangible effects are easily found also in health, education, and the food sectors, as well as in exports and the financial sector, among others. The blockade policy remains practically unchanged despite the re-establishment 2 years ago of U.S.-Cuba diplomatic relations, and despite U.S. President Barack Obama himself describing it as a failed and obsolete policy that hampers U.S. ties with the rest of the hemisphere. In October, the U.S. government made 2 announcements regarding its policy toward Cuba. The first was a presidential policy directive which expanded and promoted authorized engagement with Cuba, but again based on Washington's imperialist and hegemonic approach. The other announcement was a fifth package of measures to modify aspects in the application of the U.S. blockade. Analysts and critics agree that it represents leader movement, since it deals only with bilateral cooperation in areas such as health and the pharmaceutical industry, where Cuba registers internationally recognized advances and changes to the maritime transportation regulations, allowing now ships that dock at Cuban ports to enter U.S. harbors without having to wait for 180 days before doing so. This new package of measures omits to address important matters for Cuba, such as allowing the island to use U.S. dollars in its international transactions or authorizing U.S. investors to do business in Cuba. Prior to and following the UN vote this year on the U.S. blockade of Cuba, Representatives from several nations and blocs took the floor to raise their voices in support of Cuba and against Washington's unilateral coercive policy. Speaking on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, the representative of the Dominican Republic saluted the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba, in which context, he said, the U.S. blockade against the Caribbean state is totally anachronistic. He then urged the U.S. government and particularly the U.S. Congress to listen to the voices of the vast majority of the international community and end that policy. The representative of Mexico noted that despite the U.S. blockade, Cuba will be among the few countries in the world that will have fulfilled the UN General Assembly's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which he said attests to the political will of the Cuban government to work hard towards improving the well-being of its people, even under difficult domestic and international circumstances, further aggravated by the U.S. arbitrary blockade policy. Other nations and groupings raising their voices at the UN General Assembly in support of the Cuban-sponsored UN resolution against the U.S. blockade included China, Vietnam, Bolivia, India, Tonga, South Africa, Brazil, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Egypt, Kuwait on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Venezuela in its capacity as president of the Non-Aligned Movement, and Singapore on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In the name of the Group of 77 plus China, the representative from Thailand addressed the forum. He said that while the group welcomed the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Washington and Havana and steps